Hi guys, this is Dr. TS, and today we're going to continue in our Module 7 about cellular transport. And today we're going to talk about a type of transport called active transport. Now, hopefully the name gives away what type of transport is. So if you see active, I want you to think energy. Everything we've talked about so far, diffusion, osmosis, even facilitated diffusion, does not require any sort of input of energy in order to move things across the membrane. Active transport does. So if you see active, I want you to immediately think energy. And there's going to be two types of active transport that we talk about. One is going to use our molecule of energy, ATP, and one is going to use the energy of other molecules. And I'll break those down. So as I mentioned, active transport requires an input of energy. And the reason that it requires an input of energy is because we are moving molecules against their concentration gradient. So remember, we have a membrane. We have cell membrane. Remember, this membrane is selectively permeable. It's only going to let some things in and out, right? We keep the inside and the outside of the cell separate. And we can use diffusion and facilitated diffusion in order to move things across the membrane. Remember, diffusion, right? If we have a bunch of red molecules on the outside of the cell, right, they're going to move down their concentration gradient. They're going to go from high to low. However, sometimes we want to move things against their concentration gradient. So let's use an example here. So let's use a blue molecule, okay? And let's imagine that it's really concentrated on the inside of the cell compared to the outside of the cell. So traditionally, that molecule would want to move from high to low, so it would want to move outside of the cell. But sometimes we want to bring things in against their gradient. So in order to move from low to high, we are going to need an input of energy to do that. We can't just do that naturally. We can't just follow the physics of diffusion anymore. We now have to input energy in order to move things against their concentration gradients, or from low to high. And so, like I said, this is going to require energy. And that energy is going to come in two forms. It's going to come in ATP or the movement of another molecule. So let's talk about the first type of active transport, which we will call primary active transport. Now this one's going to be the easiest to understand because this is going to use energy in the form of ATP. Remember, ATP means adenosine triphosphate. This is our energy molecule in our cell. This is the molecule that we use to do all types of chemical reactions that require energy. So primary active transport is going to use ATP to move molecules against their concentration gradient. So in this example here, I have a little green molecule, and it has a lower concentration inside and a higher concentration outside. So usually, if it was following its concentration gradient, it would want to go from outside in. However, if we want to get this molecule inside out, if we want to go from low to high, we would use a transport protein in the membrane along with that ATP. So we were using energy to move these molecules against their concentration gradient. And remember that we're going from less concentrated to more concentrated. So this is something that these molecules do not naturally want to do. So we use an input of energy in the form of ATP in order to move that molecule across the membrane. So this is primary active transport. It uses ATP. Now the second type of active transport can be a little bit harder to understand. And if this one's called primary, the next one is called secondary. So if you remember back when you started talking about diffusion and the movement of molecules across membranes, one of the things you learned is that when molecules move down their concentration gradient, right? When they move down their concentration gradient, this actually generates energy. So you might use the kind of the example, right? If I have a floodgate, right? If I have a dam and I have a bunch of water on one side of the dam, right? There's a high concentration on one side, and I poke a hole through the dam, all of that water is going to start coming out with a lot of energy. It's going from high to low. So when a molecule moves down its concentration gradient, it produces a lot of energy. Other molecules can take advantage of this. So let's take a look at this image here. So in this image, I have purple squares and I have green squares. So the purple squares are moving down their concentration gradient. So there's more purple inside the cell than outside. And so as the purple moves down its concentration gradient, it's going from high to low. And that is going to produce energy. Now let's imagine I have another molecule, a green molecule. So there's this green molecule here and it has lower inside than outside. So the green wants to move against its concentration gradient. And so what happens is we can couple these two things together. So the movement of the purple molecules down their concentration gradient is going to provide the energy necessary to move the green molecules against their concentration gradient. So coupling the movement of these two molecules together, it's still requiring the input of energy, but that energy, instead of coming from ATP, is coming from the movement of another molecule down its concentration gradient. So secondary active transport uses that gradient that's already existing to kind of co-opt that energy to then move something against its gradient and help them move. So that is primary and secondary active transport. Both are using energy. Primary is using ATP, secondary is using the energy that another molecule is generating down its gradient. All right, thanks guys.